Hi and welcome to a new episode of the State of the Net podcast. I'm Paolo Vallemarin.
And I'm Ewan Semple.
And we are the fanboys.
Yes, unashamedly, up front.
Yeah, it always takes half an hour to start recording this because we're always running the latest beta version of everything.
And nothing just works.
But it's so good. It's so exciting. I mean, I really enjoyed this, but last week I had an important presentation that I had to do on Zoom with like a dozen people on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And everything was set up, everything was ready, everything was working. And then a thunderstorm come and the power goes away. And there's no power in the house. And we call them and they say, we're going to restore it like 12 hours later. So, and this is like 2 hours to the presentation. I said, what do? I need to find another place where I can find Wi-Fi. I asked my dad, do you have Wi-Fi at the office? Oh, yes, we have, but the Wi-Fi is not good. We use Ethernet. I said, there's nowhere I can plug an Ethernet cable in my Mac. So I go to my in-laws in Trieste. I drive to Trieste. I get there, I set up my Mac, and set up my iPad, and I decide to use the iPad as a second screen so I can run the presentation. You know, I have presenter note on my computer and the presentation on the screen. And then I start the Zoom call, and then it is here to share the screen that is shared to the iPad. Mm-hmm. That was a bit too much. I mean,
well, I think that's partly Zoom, isn't it? It doesn't allow you to do that.
It was, I mean, I don't know. It was a combination of things, but basically everything stopped. Amazingly, my voice was still going through. So
it takes a lot to stop you talking, Paolo. That's been said before.
Yeah. So I kept going through the thing without being able to change slides, or it would change like 5 minutes later. I couldn't read my presenter notes. I mean, it was awful. It kind of turned out okay anyway, but you know, when they say you shouldn't be running these things
on a production machine,
production machine, yeah, probably that's what they mean.
Well, it's funny because I'm running the beta on my watch as well, and I mean, I probably use my watch more than any other device at the moment. I'm deeply attached to it. And that felt like a big step to do that, because they say you can't go back. You can go back the next time another version of the software comes out. But anyway, it's quite a commitment to do that. But I just couldn't not. You know, they'd been warning us for the month of July that it would be out any day. And the fact that I was checking maybe 6 or 7 times a day whether it was ready or not was a pretty strong indication I was going to load it as soon as it arrived. But I'm loving it. I mean, I'm loving the fact I can script it. You know, I've got a little script that opens up a different watch face in the mornings when I wake up that's got a meditation timer on that watch face, and it all just happens, and it's magic. It's great.
Okay, let's stop talking about our little Apple devices and talk about other algorithms. Did you hear about the story with schools in the UK?
Did I hear about? I mean, there's been practically nothing else on the news for the last week or so. And to be honest, I haven't followed it in great depth, but I did, as other listeners to this show will know, I bang on all the time about the ideology of algorithms and how people have been, frankly irresponsible in not getting their heads around what that means and what the consequences are. And of course, it's become very apparent to an awful lot of parents that the algorithm, and that word's getting used all the time on the news, that some combination of the government and the education department, they're all blaming each other at the moment, but certainly algorithms were involved in deciding who got A-level passes and what type of passes they got. And so it's just suddenly opened people's eyes to the fact that this isn't some, vague, geeky, I don't need to worry about it sort of thing. It's something that actually directly affects your life,
Even if, to be honest, I mean, from the little I read, I mean, technically it is an algorithm, but all they did was adjust the existing votes they had with the each school averages, or I mean, they didn't. It wasn't anything particularly sophisticated. It's just that in a number of cases, people ended up having lower grades than they had before. And that's why they complained.
Well, I think the contentious thing was that they included the previous school performance, and it meant that So, for instance, one of my relatives got into Cambridge, but she was the first person from her comprehensive school to ever achieve that. And if she'd done her A-levels this time, she wouldn't have got in because they'd have decided that the school was an indication that she was unlikely to have got that high a mark, therefore, blah, blah, blah. And so I wrote a blog post about it the other day there where I was saying that it's this sort of, on its own, looks relatively innocuous bit of information, but when that bit of information gets used in a different context or gets combined with another bit of information, it all of a sudden becomes less innocuous and has significance that you may not have anticipated previously. So I think that's my worry about the whole thing, that once you automate meaning and that then gets buried under process, stuff just sort of happens. You don't like it, but you can't really work out why, and you can't do an awful lot about it.
In other news, now they say that not only Microsoft, but possibly also Oracle are interested in buying TikTok.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Who knew that Oracle was still going? But yeah, I mean, it's when you have the President of the United States wading in as well, it's quite a mix, isn't it? And politics in China and I don't know. I don't know enough, to be honest, to make confident statements about this. But I mean, they do seem to be being a bit over paranoid about things like Huawei and TikTok.
I don't know. I mean,
how much?
I think that, as usual, we're dealing with a extremely complex situation. On one side, it is true that there is plenty of Western applications that are not allowed in China.
Yeah, for sure.
So one would say, okay, and then we block one of theirs, and suddenly we are undemocratic. On the other hand, I don't think you can really stop this. On the other hand, you have situation like the current challenge with Epic and Apple and Google stores, and Epic being funded by a Chinese company.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, the fact that if they stop, the idea that if they prevent American companies from dealing with Chinese company, it would mean that Apple would not be able to put WeChat on their iPhones, which would basically kill the market of Apple product in China, because nobody would buy. Because, I mean, people buying an iPhone to play an Epic game is probably a pretty small number, but people buying an iPhone to use WeChat in China is pretty much everybody.
Yeah.
So there are all these intersections, and it's getting complicated. And I think it's not just. I mean, I wouldn't simplify it to Trump being Trump. I think that there is a way more complicated situation here of international relations, and how for a long time large corporation got away without caring much about human rights, and trying to prevent governments around the world from blocking and preventing users from doing stuff. And now it's happening, in multiple countries, so it's interesting.
And it probably, it is a sign that the technology companies do have significant power and influence. And, again, we've talked about this before, about how governments aren't, in many respects, keeping up with that. In fact, in some ways, the example of the algorithms in education we were just talking about, or the tracking app in the UK that was a bit of a fiasco as well. I mean, there's just so many examples of where governments and politicians are just really not keeping up with what to many of us is now the real world. And, we've again touched on this in the past about where we're comfortable with decisions being made, and, whether we allow, if that's the right word, tech companies to make what in a sense are political decisions or not, and if by intervening we make it worse. It's a real interesting catch-22 situation with a lot of this, that we don't want inappropriate or damaging legislation, but we equally don't want them unregulated. And I don't really see an easy way at the moment to bridge that gap.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what Apple, Google, and the big companies will do, because they are so big, so powerful, sitting on so much money. But I wonder how much. It's not so much how much political power they have, but is how much political power they want to have.
Yeah.
Because I think that a lot of the success of these companies is actually based on them not doing anything. I mean, being as neutral as possible and just trying to adapt to different situations, trying to make as much money as they can in every different environment.
Mm-hmm.
And now that these environments are starting to enter in a conflict between each other, suddenly they will have to take some position in some situation. I mean, Apple appeared to they just threw out Epic from their developer program, apparently.
Yeah.
And
they're clearly prepared to take. I mean, it's just fascinating imagining the meetings and the conversations that have to go on to get to decide things like that, and going through the various consequences of things like that. I mean, it's the other thing that occurred to me just as you were saying about the political environment. I mean, goodness knows we don't want a war, but it would be, the next war, wherever the next war is fought on any kind of large scale, is going to involve technology to a scale never seen before.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, it's not hard to imagine wars that will only be fought on technology platforms. And and this is why things like cybersecurity are mattering so much these days, because why bother putting your soldiers at risk or spending all that money on bombs when we can just pull the plug on people's IT systems? It's power is going to be fought over in these spaces, as well as regulated, which is going to be just fascinating again to see where the big companies sit with that, which are global companies. They don't want to get involved in fights,
It reminds me of a story I read many years ago about Venice when it was a great power in the Mediterranean, but all the way to China. And every time Venice would, and Venice was quite combative. They would go to war all the time.
Yeah.
But their wars they were essentially merchants, so their wars were always fought with the purpose of getting some kind of gain.
Well, you could say the same of the British Empire, couldn't you, really, in terms of Hong Kong and India, and it was all about the merchants and money. Yeah.
And what I thought was interesting in this story is that by definition, every time Venice would go to war with somebody, they always had an open channel of negotiation. So they were fighting a war on one side, but they were negotiating on the other.
Interesting.
And as soon as they would get to a deal, they would stop the war. So the war was essentially just a pressure point.
Interesting.
And this author was comparing this situation to what is happening today, where usually the first act in a war is to shut down the embassy. So basically, we're done talking. Now we're going to fight. And say, but if you shut down the embassy, how do you keep the conversation open? You almost have the feeling that there's no point in the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if when the next wars are fought, when the next wars involve this very large corporation, are we going back to trading wars where essentially, yes, you fight, but you're trying to find a deal to some degree? And I'm not saying that it's necessarily better,
no,
but at least it's still better than going to war with the only purpose of obliterating the enemy.
I find it an unfathomable mindset, really. I mean, I still struggle with what are they fighting over, because there's no winner. I mean, how many wars have we seen that show that there's not really a winner? Or in fact, very, very often, the Second World War, the losers were the winners. But in terms of Japan and Germany and their economies after the war, it's such a we seem to be stumbling into so many things at the moment.
I think that for the first time we're stumbling into things at a scale we've never seen before. I mean, we'd never. I mean, yes, there were the IBMs and other large American companies involved in World War II, but was nothing compared to what it is today.
No.
What I think is interesting is that the interest of this very large corporation is essentially peace. I mean,
yes, they need to be able to sell
Apple,
stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, Apple and Google and Facebook and everybody want everybody to be at peace so they can keep buying shit and be happy and watch advertising and buy more shit. So their interest is clearly to find a deal, and I wonder if this is going to have. I mean, regardless of what politicians say, I wonder if these big concentration of money, if not power, is going to have an impact that we don't see yet.
Well, just thinking about the balance or where the economic power in technology rests, because heading into, I guess, the last two world wars, technology or the fastest moving and the most advanced technology was military. And there was a vested interest in because they could sell, they could make. I mean, companies made vast millions out of the wars, but this time round, I was about to say, civilian technologies further ahead than military. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, but it's certainly a far greater percentage of the available pot of technology spend. That's for sure.
Well, I do think that these days civilian technology is the most advanced. I mean, I think that a company like Apple or Samsung or these large technology company, the amount of money that they sink in developing technology, in developing hardware, in developing chips is unprecedented, and it's nothing compared, and it's huge compared to whatever they spend in military technology. So
maybe
yes, there is still some very advanced technology that is, but look, even space missions are private these days.
That's true.
I mean, it used to be that and if you look at the competition between SpaceX and Boeing, I mean the Lockheed, the competitor, I mean the winning one is a private company. I mean it's almost a consumer company. So yeah, that is probably another interesting aspect. I think that most of these companies are going to thrive in a stable situation.
Yeah.
So they will use their influence to stabilize things.
It's hard to imagine.
Just makes sense.
Isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, Apple could just buy the U.S. government. Just buy. I mean, I think they have enough cash. Just buy them out.
They're certainly better run.
Or they could do a joint venture, Google, Apple, instead of having two parties, you have two companies. You just vote for your.
Well, this is something we've talked about before. Do we have more? Can we exercise more influence over commercial companies through what we do or don't buy, any more than we can attempt to vote in some pretty imperfect voting systems these days? It's interesting, isn't it?
Well, we vote for these companies every time we buy their products.
That's what I'm thinking. I know.
And I guess it's a little bit more of a problem because I mean, we definitely we do give plenty of votes to Apple. We don't vote for Facebook or for Google. You don't pay for their services, so you're not really deciding. You might decide not to use their services, but that becomes a slightly indirect route.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's kind of like rigged voting on their behalf.
Oh, look, they have just added the West Wing, the TV show on Prime here in Italy, and I've started watching it again, and it used to be one of my favorite TV shows in history, but I haven't. I mean, I saw it the first season aired in 1999, so it's 20 years old.
Gosh, yeah.
And it's still so good. I mean,
Yeah.
it's written so well. The dialogues are so good. I mean, it's fiction. I appreciate that, no politician, no one on the planet speaks like that, but it's still so good. I mean, if you like, there's plenty of fictional characters that we like. I mean, if you like Iron Man, I like President Bartlett.
I've never seen a West Wing, I have to confess.
Oh, I highly recommend it. It's so well written. It's brilliant.
Well, we're currently, as I think I said, going through Ashes to Ashes and Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes, and just again being blown away by that and the sort of profundity of it in some ways, and it's funny because I mean I'm reading a book at the moment about how we perceive the world and the differences between conception and perception, and the fact that most of what we think is reality is actually a concept. And it's the sort of stuff that once you start getting into mindfulness and meditation, whatever, you start to pick apart. And it is funny how these things all sort of start to come together, because as some of the folks listening might know, my mother passed away last week, and so we've been grappling with that, what it means, how we feel, and dealing with some of the consequences. And this morning there was a really, really funny coming together where, as I say, I'm reading this book about consciousness, which has gone into perception and talks about quantum mechanics and talks about Schrodinger's cat and the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and how waves can be, an atom or an electron can be a wave or a particle depending how you look at it, all that stuff. And then I go on, and this relates to technology, because I go into the government's Tell Us Once website, which I was slightly worried about, because it says tell us once, but before you tell us, you have to get her driving license, her passport number, and her national insurance number. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, so I do all the work and then tell you once. But in fact, I then get into the website, and the first question is, are you the executor operating on behalf of the deceased? Or if not, do you have their permission? Right? So 2 separate dependent questions with only one checkbox choice between yes or no. Right? So I'm immediately feeling like Schrodinger's cat. Well, I'm thinking, well, I can't not answer, but neither answer is going to be right, because the first question hasn't been answered yet, And then it became incredibly appropriate, because my mum once came home and told the family about a friend of hers who'd been doing up her garden and had built 2 ponds with a bridge between them. Right? And then wondered why we all looked at her and fell about laughing. Yeah. So you either wade through one pond to get to the bridge to go over the bit of dry land, or you use the bridge to cross the bit of dry land that you could just walk along between the 2 ponds, right? And Mum never quite got why we found this so funny. So the combination of Schrodinger's cat, the 2 ponds with a bridge between them, and being asked this question that I can't answer without being wrong either way I answer it, was a colliding of many aspects of my life at the same moment. But actually, I mean, that issue about how we label things and what we call things, and the fact that as soon as you have a database, you have to call them something, again loops back to the schools and what things mean and what they mean now and what they might mean in the future. And the book I'm reading is about the fact that we convince ourselves that reality, that the conceptual fiction that we make up, the process of labeling and seeing things as separate, we convince ourselves that is reality. But actually reality isn't. It's complex, it's chaotic, it's behind that, it's underneath that, it's the oneness, to quote Buddhism. And we get ourselves in an awful mess and upset ourselves because of clinging to this fiction. And we do it because we think it gives us control. But it doesn't give us control, it just makes us worry that we're out of control. And it's a bit like the wars, You decide who's good, who's bad. You decide almost randomly to fight over something. And the next thing you know, millions of people are dying over labels and stories. It's quite bizarre.
I'm observing how the news are pretty much been all over the place in Italy about the pandemics, because things have started. I mean, the numbers are growing again, not as fast as the first round, but enough to create some concern.
Yeah.
And I guess that there has, for some time, there was sort of, everybody had a pace, probably because maybe because somebody might have said something at some point, trying to rein in the press, to say, okay, you just can't go shouting over everything that happens. It's not going to help everybody. But clearly that grace period is expired, and now it's again all over the place.
Yeah.
And I keep reading mostly reference to news in my streams, and you realize that I think that a lot of people are in good faith when they are reporting these things, whether it's negating it is happening, or it is happening, or it's terrible, or we're all gonna die, or it's nothing, or it's just cold, or it's just people coming back from holiday. It's Croatia, it's Greece, it's Spain, or it's people, or it's immigrants. Oh my God, it's immigrants now. Immigrants are coming, they are suffering, and I can understand how somebody might get confused. I mean, it's totally clear, the fact that you start not believing in anything you're hearing. And I mean, I'm realizing myself that I'm sort of comfortable with not understanding. I mean, it's like, okay, I'm getting all this information. I don't need to make a decision. I don't need to, most of the time, I don't need to understand this. But I think that to many people there is this pressure that said, "Oh, so is this good? Is bad? Is it going well, or is it going worse?" And we have this pressure of we need to make a decision. We need to take a position about something. When the truth is that no, you don't. You can just sit there.
Well, and you can't in many cases. I mean, that's the thing about the news. It gets people wound up about things that they can't actually do anything about or affect. In fact, there's a book on my book list that I'm looking forward to. It's called Stop Reading the News, and it's apparently very good and quite philosophical about the consequences and the overwhelming upsides of not wasting energy fretting about stuff that you can't change. Because again, culturally, there's this. It's a bit like not voting. You're seen as letting the side down or being irresponsible, or and I watched over the last few years both my parents getting wound up by all sorts of things that were never going to affect them, just because they had this sense of duty that they should watch the news at 6 o'clock. And they looked slightly upset when I just would walk out the room. I thought, I just don't want to hear this.
I think that it's not just the pressure to watch the news, but is the pressure of taking a position about it. So where do you stand about that thing? And it's like, nowhere. I don't need to. I don't. I enjoy very much following the news, reading the. I mean, I find this interesting. I learn a lot of things, but I don't need to take a position about why half of Lebanon blew up. It's like, okay, I'm reading these reports. It's interesting. There are many conflicting ideas. And I read the story about the country, the politics, and it's interesting. I learn a whole number of things I didn't know before. I'm happy about that. Mm-hmm. I don't need to take a position about it.
And it's interesting as well, because I got approached about doing something with a knowledge management group, and I sort of sat and struggled over whether I would or wouldn't say yes, and I've said no because I just feel disinclined to get back involved in that world of having to take a position, of having to label things. It seems such a waste of energy to me now. I mean, that may change. I mean, I'm obviously in a sort of odd hiatus with stopping driving and lockdown happening and then mum passing away, but it's in the same way as you just described your own feelings, Paolo. I'm increasingly comfortable with just being in that Not irresponsible, not noticing, not caring, but equally not inclined to respond to that obligation to take a position on things. You know, it's just finding everything interesting. I mean, it goes back to something we've talked about before, about just being curious about stuff and staying curious, not wanting to pin it down, beat it to death and stick it on a shelf somewhere. You know, it's staying open to what's happening. Certainly is a resilient way of looking at life, I think.
I think that it is probably the only way forward. I mean, given the amount of stimuli that we that keeps growing, you know, you need to protect yourself. You basically need to, and either you go into, you know, you become fundamentalist about something, or you need to step back and let the thing flow, and, you know, watch it and be curious about it and learn about it. And you know, sometimes you have to make decisions. I mean, sometimes you have to take a position, and in that case I think that you're going to be much wiser because you have been watching the flow. Oh my God, we're getting very philosophical about this.
And why not, Paolo?
Very zen. Anyway, I think that it's helpful. I mean, it's something that I've been telling to a whole bunch of, you know, friends and family that I meet, and they're all upset about things. It's like, what's the point? Just step back. It's not.
Yes, and that's right. You're
usually
right.
this pisses them off even more, but I'm still not very good at explaining this concept.
But it's getting worse, isn't it? I mean, that, you know, sadly, a lot of people use the internet as a sort of an outrage engine, and don't protect themselves from that outrage. They indulge in indulge sounds like I'm making a moral judgment on them, but they get sucked into the outrage. And one of the other things that's happened over this period is that I've just sort of drifted away from Facebook, and you know, part of me misses it because I used to like the exchanges I had with people, and I'm very lucky. I've got friends all around the world, and it's been lovely when I posted something briefly about Mum, that just really, really thoughtful and nice comments from people like literally all over the world. And I'll be sorry, I am sorry not to be as engaged with that, but I'm not sorry not to be spending time in Facebook or Twitter, because they're increasingly just dissatisfaction engines of various sorts.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think you're fully considering the consequences. I mean, for example, I have no idea about the state of your cat. I haven't seen a photo of your cat for months now.
It was me thinking you were about to make a serious point. Well, no, it's interesting because I am troubled by this, because I've been banged on about social was somebody else's word, but the potential to connect and talk to people, it seems a bit contradictory to disconnect from people. But I think I'm more readjusting. I think it is that balancing act between groupthink, where you stop thinking things that you think will upset people, or you stop saying things because you think they might upset people, and you just can't face what I used to call my Greek chorus of people who would just all bang their gums whenever I said something they didn't agree with. I won't be sorry to not have that. But the trouble is, if you move away altogether, then I'm just me talking on my own on my blog.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that achieve? You know, apart from hopefully keeping me slightly sane. That was a telling silence, Paul. I think we should stop, don't you?
And on this note, I think we can wrap up today's episode. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And
we'll see you next time.
Tune in some future episode. Thank you.